Ho Rui An with us next. He's an artist and writer working in the intersections of contemporary art, cinema, performance, and theory. Across the mediums of lecture, essay, and film, his research examines systems of governance in the global age. He has presented projects at Bangkok Art Biennial, Asian Art Biennial, Gwangju Biennial, Jakarta Biennial, Shenzhen Biennial, Courtauld Institute of Art Biennial, Courtauld Institute of Art, Berlin, Singapore Art Museum, and Art Museum Eindhoven, and Yamaguchi Center for Art and Media Japan. In 2019, he was awarded the International Film Critics Prize at the International Short Film Festival in Oldenhausen, Germany. And in 2018, he was a fellow of the DAAD Artists in Berlin program. So yeah, we'll hear from Brian now. Thanks.
First of all, thank you very much to EC and for inviting me to be here in Manchester to present this work that you see downstairs, and also to share a little bit about the research behind this body of work that I've been working on in the past few years. I guess I would just jump right into the work itself. So I don't think, probably not everyone has seen the film or seen it in its entirety, but essentially I started this film. This film is called 24 Cinematic Points of View of Factory Gate in China. And the starting point for this project were actually these surveillance footage that were captured by cameras that were being placed in front of the factory gates of certain factories in China. And this was footage that I had gathered from a website that was investigating these companies for fraud. So many of these footages started appearing, I think this was around 2013 to 2014, when there was a lot of interest in investing in the so-called Chinese economic miracle. And this was especially given the context of the fallout of the global financial crisis in 2008, when many of these fund managers in the US in particular were rediverting their investments towards China. And that was also the time when many Chinese companies started popping up on the New York Stock Exchange, sometimes quite without explanation. And what was actually happening during this period was that there was some of these hedge fund managers in the US, they managed to find a kind of legal loophole to quickly list these companies, because usually if there's a company on the stock exchange, it requires a different, a whole set of processes like auditing, etc. But essentially, they merged many of these Chinese companies with companies that are already American companies, mostly kind of shell companies that are already listed on the New York Stock Exchange. And overnight, a Chinese company kind of appears on the New York Stock Exchange, and American investors can kind of share a part of the so-called Chinese economic miracle. But of course, after some time, some investors started getting suspicious of these factories because you weren't sure what you were investing in, because you all of these investors wouldn't have even been to China or even have any clue what exactly is this factory producing. And so some of these investors, they call themselves kind of due diligence investors. They decided to take things into their own hands and try to investigate to find out if the company is indeed worth as much as it was claimed on the financial receipts. And the method that they went about doing so was extremely peculiar, because they would put a surveillance camera in front of the factory gates of these companies, and this camera would be placed there for a period of an entire year, 24 hours, and they would kind of calculate or look at the number of workers and vehicles moving in and out of the factory, and kind of use that as almost a kind of auditing process to see if it mirrors the value of the company as reported on the stock exchange. And of course, there was a very interesting kind of backstory to this, because a lot of these companies were also betting on these Chinese companies on the stock market, what they call short selling them, meaning that you would bet that these companies would kind of fail And so if these companies eventually, the value of the stock drops, you having placed a bet against them would also have financial reward from this process. So on the one hand, these American due diligence companies were investigating the Chinese companies, apparently for moral reasons. They also had a financial gain to be reaped if in the event that it turns out that these companies were fraudulent. So it was a kind of very murky kind of moral field, so to speak. But when I first saw these footages and the view of this factory gate, I kind of immediately was returned to the very first film of cinema, which is Workers Leaving the Factory. And I mean, most of you would be familiar with this. This is often described as the very first motion picture ever made. It's called Workers Leaving the Lumière Factory, shot by the Lumière brothers, who were industrialists and also kind of credited as the pioneers of cinema. And this is just aiming a footage that they shot by aiming their camera at the factory gate. And of course, this is an image that has been widely written about, and most famously by the German filmmaker Ho Rui An, where he was kind of reflecting on what does it mean for cinema to begin from the space outside the factory, but never entering the factory. What does it mean for cinema to begin when workers leave the factory and enter into the world of labor and consumption? So, and Ho Rui An subsequently also made an essay film called Workers Leaving the Factory. I mean, he gave it the exact same title. And he kind of reflected on over 100 years of cinema of workers leaving the factory. Why is it that cinema is so attracted to this motive of workers walking out of the factory? And so that became a kind of starting point for me to collect images of factories, of factory films of workers leaving the factory, to try to understand how is it that we started out with this image and somehow ended with this almost similar image captured by these surveillance footage that were placed in front of these Chinese factories. And of course, very often, I mean, in the kind of Hollywood or kind of Western European tradition that we're familiar with, you see workers leaving the factory, and the narrative often starts when the worker leaves the factory, because that is when the romance starts, and this is the kind of classical Hollywood formula. The camera is not really interested in the world of labor or production. The story can only begin when the worker leaves, sheds their class identity as workers and enters into this kind of so-called free and unbounded space of leisure and consumption. And very often you see the worker, he or she walks out of the factory, and immediately they meet a suitor of the opposite sex, and this kind of heterosexual romance then unfolds and unravels along with the narrative. And so this is a very common trope in kind of classical Hollywood cinema, where you see a very clear division between the world of production, the world of labor, and the world of leisure. And the factory gate is almost this threshold that divides these two very separate worlds. One of the rare occasions where workers are not leaving the factory for leisure is when they are going on a demonstration, for example. And this would be, and you see much less of these films, but this film, for example, was, some of you may know this British film from 1941, I think, called Love on the Dole. And actually it depicts an actual event not far from here in Salford, if I'm not wrong. And this was a film that was set during the Depression, and this march that was taking place is based on the actual event that was organized at that time by the Communist-led National Unemployed Workers Movement to protest the reductions in unemployment benefits. And so this is kind of a turning moment of kind of cinematic representations of workers, where they leave the factory not because they are getting off a day's work, but because they have been laid off and there is a lack of employment opportunities that characterize the entire economic climate of the time of the Depression era. So of course I started out working mostly with these films, which are mostly kind of American and European films, which actually at some point I was very curious. what then would be the representation of labor in Chinese cinema? How were workers being depicted in Chinese cinema around the same time? And how would that help us kind of gain an understanding of these surveillance footage images that we saw at the start? And so with that, I started researching into worker films that were made in China beginning in the 1950s. And right now, I will show you an excerpt from one of these films. So I will play the excerpt first, and you can watch it, and then I will talk a little bit more later.
有人总是在讲啊，亲戚老爷，老爷亲戚，可是我们人不老爷，人是决定一切的。现在在搞革命，假如我们不懂经济，不掌握技术，那还搞什么技术革命呢？所以还搞得上不要把问题看得太容易，学会研究机器的工作不简单。我们培养个宝强工要多少年呢？没什么神秘的，你别把问题看太复杂了，好吧？你可以做到，这个我完全相信。你是全国劳动模范，哎呀，劳动模范也是人类，有谁生下来就是劳动模范了？劳动模范能做到的事，只要我们肯做，为什么做不到啊？是啊，学习好研究工作法的时候，大家都说做不到，现在不是每个人都做到了？不过修理机器，我们女工的力气是比较小的。这个也要有窍门呢，光凭力气是不行的。难道保全部的女工力气都是大的？我到现在还是搞不通，保媒提出我们女工自己修理机器，是不是有这个必要？因为工作总是有分工的，分工也要看情况，分工是要的，但是分工过细以后是会降低我们工人技术水平的。我觉得没什么可以争论的。问题很简单，车子出了毛病，是着急着等待呢，还是主动去解决它？对啊，我还是这句话，保媒自己可以做到。不过我认为要拿到群众中去推广是有问题的。你这是哪个群众啊？你这是群众是谁？不要这么来，大家等一等，让他讲，你讲。我不懂技术，但是对于挡车工人提出自己修理机器，这是纺织工人当中从来没有的事情。对于这种大胆革新的精神，我们是应该支持的。是啊，大家一个一个的发言，我们有不同的意见，还可以展开充分的辩论。
So this film is called Wang Baobei, and it was made in 1958. And this was also the year when the Communist Party of China launched what was known as the Great Leap Forward, which was actually a kind of very far-reaching and also ultimately quite devastating economic experiment that sought to de-link the Chinese economic model from the Soviet system. So prior to the 1950s, of course, as we know, the Soviet Union and Chinese Communist Party were pretty much aligned, but there was a split that started towards the 50s, especially after the death of Stalin. And in China, in the Chinese Communist Party, they saw that the Soviet Union was kind of dismantling the Stalinist state system and were afraid of the kind of implications of the Chinese model. And because of that reason, that resulted in what we know today as the Sino-Soviet split. And with that historical context, with that split, also came the withdrawal of technological and economic aid from the Soviet Union, which was a very kind of devastating and dire situation for China, being that it was an economy that didn't have, that was still, lacked a lot of resources. So within that context, the Chinese Communist Party, they turned to mass mobilization as a solution for spurring productivity and innovation under these very austere conditions. And so so essentially what you see in the film is this form of worker self-organization that were being promoted during that time. And interestingly, within the film industry, the very production, the film production itself also espoused many of these values. So during this period, one of the genres that was being actively promoted by the leadership, especially the Premier Dou Enlai at that time, was the genre of the docudrama, not because he was very interested in blending fiction and reality, but because it was very cheap to make docudramas as opposed to making a fiction film. And so you can make a lot of these docudramas, and you can do it at lower budgets, and at the same time you could also have a more kind of collective scripting process. So the film Wang Baomei was essentially a product of that process. So the titular figure, the protagonist Wang Baomei, which is the woman that you see speaking, she's essentially playing herself in the film, and she was in that year what they call a model worker. So the Communist Party would often kind of nominate model workers to be promoted nationwide to encourage others to aspire to the levels of productivity. At the same time, basically all the workers in the film are actual workers of the factory that is being featured, that is being filmed. So everyone is essentially kind of playing a version of themselves. And also the original film, the original footage would also have been shot in Shanghainese, and then it was only later dubbed into Mandarin or Putonghua, which is what you hear in the eventual film. And when I saw these films, not just Wang Baomei, but the films that were produced during this period, it was almost quite a jolt to the system, because very often, on the one hand, classical Hollywood cinema is not interested. It retreats from the space of labor. It doesn't even depict the world of the worker. And then on the other hand, you also have Soviet cinema that was interested in depicting workers, but was always more interested in the act of physical labor. So in Soviet cinema, which I talk a little bit about in the film downstairs, you always see the worker being, engaged in it. They're often quite muscular, and they're always engaged in this very sweaty, back-breaking labor. And then I saw Chinese cinema where the workers are curiously not working so much as they are talking endlessly. So they talk, instead of working, they talk about work. Or instead of operating the machines, they talk about operating the machines and all the kind of ideological implications of operating the machines. And this was something that reflected the significant divergence between the Soviet model and the Chinese model. And the Chinese model was, at that time, the emphasis was also ideological education. And it wanted to break down the distinction between manual and intellectual labor. And this is a very classic kind of scene in which you see the manual worker kind of standing up and talking back to the technician or the party cadre as a way to kind of dissolve these distinctions, or telling them, who are you to, why can't I, as a manual worker, also repair machines? Why can't I make kind of managerial decisions? And this was a kind of archetype of the cinema at the time, well, because whether it reflected the actual realities on the ground is another issue, but this was something that was actively promoted by the party as a way to get the workers to be motivated and self-motivated and to kind of push the economy. And so this idea of speech, of course, becomes quite interesting to think about, because and it was also something quite specific to the Chinese Communist project, where workers were always encouraged to speak up. They were always encouraged to almost kind of perform, always perform ideology at the level of the body. And this was something that was given, its fullest expression during the Cultural Revolution, when sometimes workers would even, rush into offices of the party cadres and, criticize them, accuse them of, not obeying the mass line, or, having forgotten communist orthodoxy, so to speak. And the interesting thing about how this really came out was really that if you think about China at the time, very often if you think about kind of Marxist theory of how revolution happens, of course Marx and Engels of course spent time in Manchester, and he imagined that a city that would be highly industrialized would provide the ideal conditions of a revolution. But of course, historically, this is almost never the case. In fact, historically, the countries where they had a revolution were largely agrarian populations. So whereas UK, which had the most industrialized population at the time, was where a revolution didn't happen, especially not in the kind of as Marxists would imagine. But of course, the Chinese Communist Party had a challenge. How do you translate to a largely agrarian population concepts of class, concepts of alienation, concepts of that were at the very center of Marxist thought? How would peasants be able to understand what capitalism is? And so one of the strategies that the Communist Party came up with was that they used existing oral traditions that were already prevalent in the villages. And there's this tradition in the village called, in English called speaking bitterness, in Chinese called 诉苦. And usually you would have, let's say, a kind of, usually, and it's usually performed by women, let's say you have an aggrieved wife who wanted to, who wanted to, kind of scold her husband, her husband has cheated on her or whatever, and so she would go to the center of the village and basically, vent, and speak her bitterness and get the entire village to come and be a kind of a trial of public opinion as a way of enacting this kind of communal justice. And essentially, these forms of oral traditions that have long been prevalent in village life were eventually appropriated by the Chinese Communist Party to be turned against capitalists or whoever they identified as class enemies. And you see a kind of, in a way, a kind of performance of this within this little segment. And of course, this logic would become quite absurd when it came to the Cultural Revolution, where it got to the point where it mattered less what you were saying than who you were or who the person said. What mattered more was who was doing the speaking rather than what was being said. So if you were a worker or if you were a peasant, your words immediately gained a kind of authenticity that allowed you to kind of label people as class enemies, and that was also how intellectuals or so-called bourgeoisie were being attacked during the Cultural Revolution. And which is why the interesting thing about Chinese cinema is that when there's a very different depiction of the factory gate, so this is I found a lot of these motifs of Chinese workers at the factory gate, but then they're actually neither walking in nor walking out, but they're just standing at the gate and talking among themselves as if they were indifferent to the gate being this barrier. So as if the kind of barrier between the world of labor and production and leisure and consumption didn't exist. So you always see these workers just kind of casually walking in and out of the factory gate I'm not quite sure, was it because every hour of the day is labor or if every hour of the day is leisure, because this entire distinction between labor and leisure kind of breaks down and workers are just usually seen talking most of the time. I'm going to end up with another excerpt. That this excerpt would push us about 20 years into after the Cultural Revolution, and this was during the Reform era when China basically abandoned the communist state system and started embracing market reforms. And in these films, we start to see a very different political economy of speech. It's a very different mode of speaking that takes place in these films. So I'll play this short excerpt.
过去都怪我们没把工作做好，伤了你们的心。可如今中央下了决心，我们也下了决心。为什么居然就这么难？使我感到伤心的是，有很多人，包括我的老战友，都不理解我。直到10分钟前还对我唠叨说：“你会没有退路的。”没有退路并不是坏事。当初打仗那年月，为什么人人拼命？就是因为没有退路，不革命就没法子活了。现在可怕的是，人人都有了退 机器，有些齿轮已经锈住了，咬死了。可只要用我们的血做润滑剂，这话已经说烂了，不时髦了，没人要听。可无论如何，我们的血总是热的。
So in the late 1970s, China launched its opening up and reform agenda, and that marked its gradual dismantling of the kind of state-owned system in order to embrace kind of market reform, so to speak. And at that time, you also started to see a significant change in the way that workers, factories, factory work were being depicted in cinema. So this is a film that was made and that was released in 1984 called Blood is Always Hot, 血总是热的. And very clearly you can almost see the kind of stylistic differences. So the context of this film is that it is set in one of these state-owned factories, and of course, as part of this transition towards the market economy, some of these state-owned factories had to embrace had to be restructured in the principles, according to the principles of the market. Some had to be privatized or be forced to go bankrupt. And of course, there was a lot of resistance coming from within the state, the socialist system, because if you were a worker who were working in the socialist system, you actually there were a lot of kind of benefits that came from being a part of this very kind of secure system. And so there was a lot of resistance towards that, whereas the Communist Party, the leadership, or at least the reformist wing of it, really wanted to push ahead with the reforms. They wanted to push forward the idea that we had to embrace the market, if not the economy would suffer and the country would not survive. So essentially you see this kind of conflict being at the center of many of these narratives. And it's very often enacted through the conflict between a very determined manager who has these new ideas about the market, who wants to reform the factory according to these new principles of the so-called socialist market economy, versus these kind of old ideologues who are still holding on to kind of the old economic system. But also with this shift, you also started to see a very different representation in terms of who gets to speak. So over here, this is actually a scene that takes place towards the end of the film, pretty much at its climax. And this is really a recurring motive of these films, where the workers, instead of speaking, they are the ones who are silent, and they be relegated to a position of listening. And you would have this manager, usually a male, quite a kind of charismatic leader, who makes this grand, passionate speech at the end to tell people why we must do these reforms, why there is no alternative, and not the economy would collapse. And another thing that's very, very interesting, if you pay attention to the words he uses, he's actually almost using vocabulary and vernacular that is directly inherited from the communist era. So and this was something quite distinctive about the films at the time, and also about the political language of the reform era. So although you were effectively moving the system towards a capitalist system, you were talking about the market, very often these leaders, these state managers would talk about the market using revolutionary language, as if the market was just another stage in the so-called communist revolution. And over here he ends off with this very passionate statement. You almost think that this was a film of the 50s, because it says you have to use your blood as a lubricant in order to oil this machine of the Chinese economy, because our blood is always hot. And then so you see a very different model of speech, but it's also a model of speech where the state or the manager is speaking on behalf of the workers, and the workers are left mostly silent. And I think I'll end on this point. Thank you.